Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. James tossed the old suitcase aside, rummaging through the garage that held nearly a decade's worth of life with Diane. They'd built this home together, arranged the little quirks and details of their life as carefully as the items filling every shelf. Today, his mission was simple: make space for the new lawn mower he had his eyes on. But as his hand touched the aged leather of Diane's suitcase, memories stirred, and a sliver of nostalgia caught him off guard. He'd seen her carry it years ago, on countless work trips, bringing back keychains and souvenirs from her travels. Yet, opening the dusty case, he found himself staring at something else entirely. Nestled among some outdated conference badges, he found souvenirs from cities Diane had never mentioned. Paris postcards, a silver charm from Prague, and a small bottle of wine from Napa Valley. They didn't add up. Diane's work had always been hectic, demanding, but it was predictable. She had her routine cities, the same conferences. Nothing in their years together hinted at these unfamiliar places. The seeds of doubt, which he'd previously pushed aside, now began to sprout roots. James chuckled bitterly, closing the suitcase and setting it on a shelf. He would ask her. It was probably a mistake, something she'd bought online or picked up for friends or family. Still, as the day wore on, a gnawing curiosity grew within him, like a moth circling a flame. When Diane returned home that evening, cheerful and chatty, James found himself faltering. The question lingered on the tip of his tongue, but he kept it in. How could he question her without sounding ridiculous? They had built a life together based on trust. But when Diane excused herself for a shower, James couldn't help himself. He reached for her phone. They'd shared passwords since the early days of their marriage, not because they needed to, but because they trusted each other. In her email inbox, he noticed an unfamiliar name popping up frequently: Jeremy. Harmless, he reasoned. Diane worked with dozens of people across the industry. But as he scrolled, the tone of these emails shifted. The formal exchanges evolved into jokes, inside references, and then subtle hints of something deeper, something personal. The truth crashed down around him in waves. Jeremy was no simple colleague. Diane's work trips weren't always what they seemed. James clicked open another email, hands trembling as he read through the light flirtations turned intimate exchanges. The email threads painted a picture he couldn't bear to look at directly. Every word was a betrayal, a brick dislodged from the fortress of trust he had once taken for granted. He sat back in disbelief, the garage around him a blur as memories of their life together flooded him. Her face when they first met, the way she'd laugh at his terrible jokes, the way she'd look at him on lazy Sunday mornings, they all felt hollow now, tainted by the knowledge he could never unlearn. He closed his eyes, battling the painful clarity piercing through his heart. With the days that followed, he grew restless, every interaction tinged with an underlying tension. At night, while she slept beside him, he lay awake, dissecting every moment they'd shared. He questioned his instincts, wondering how he'd missed the signs, how he'd become so blind. Their morning conversations grew strained. He became distant, watching her closely, questioning each smile and each gesture, seeing betrayal where once he saw love. Diane noticed the change but didn't comment, and he didn't dare bring it up, dreading a confrontation he wasn't ready for. But secrets rarely stay buried. Diane's next trip came sooner than expected, and as she packed, his simmering anger bubbled dangerously close to the surface. She kissed him on the cheek, her smile familiar but now, to him, deceptive. He felt the anger in his throat, but he forced himself to remain silent, letting her leave without incident. The door clicked shut, and James was alone. The silence of the house weighed on him, the echo of his own thoughts drowning out any rationality. He decided to dig deeper. It was impulsive, yes, but he had to know the full extent of her deceit. He called her office under the guise of being a concerned husband and, with feigned innocence, asked for her travel records for the last year, pretending it was a mix-up with some tax filings. What he found confirmed his worst suspicions. Her trips to Orlando had coincided with Jeremy's conferences, her late nights at work aligning too perfectly with his schedule. His mind spun, barely able to process the extent of her deception. Each new piece of evidence cut deeper, unraveling the love he'd held onto for so long. He felt sick, like he'd swallowed a stone that sat heavy and unforgiving in his stomach. This woman, the love of his life, had crafted an illusion he'd willingly bought into, and now he was left alone, standing among the broken shards of his trust. When she finally returned, the confrontation he'd avoided felt inevitable. The quiet that had once been a comfort was now stifling, oppressive. Over dinner, he struggled to hold back the tidal wave of anger, fighting the urge to shout, to demand answers. She chattered on about her trip, mentioning familiar names and events with the same nonchalance as always. He watched her, stunned by how effortlessly she lied, how smoothly she wore the mask of his loving wife. But it was her mention of Jeremy, almost an afterthought, that broke him. "Oh, Jeremy says hello," she said, smiling as if this man was just another harmless friend. He felt his hands clench involuntarily, the veins in his neck pulsing as he tried to keep his voice steady. "Do you and Jeremy spend a lot of time together?" he asked, his tone sharper than he'd intended. Diane looked up, momentarily caught off guard, but recovered quickly. "Oh, just at conferences, you know how it is." She laughed, brushing it off with a wave of her hand, but her eyes flickered with something else, a shadow of unease. James felt his control slip. "I'm sure you two are close, given how much time you spend together." His voice trembled, and the words tasted bitter, laced with all the accusations he had yet to voice. Diane's smile faltered. She set her fork down, her gaze narrowing as she studied him. "What are you getting at, James?" The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded. James felt the weight of it settle on his chest, suffocating him. He took a deep breath, bracing himself. There was no going back now. "Why don't you tell me about Orlando?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The silence after James's question was thick, as though the air between them had solidified. Diane's fork paused midway to her mouth, her smile slipping as she absorbed his words. Her eyes met his, calculating and guarded, searching for the depth of what he knew. James saw it, a flash of something almost like panic. For years, he had loved those eyes, but now he found them cold, alien, reflecting a truth she had carefully hidden. "What about Orlando?" she asked, her voice measured, forcing a laugh as if his question were absurd. He forced a smile, but his voice was steel. "Don't play coy. You know exactly what I mean." Diane's laughter faded, replaced by a stare that felt confrontational. She set her fork down slowly, her hand steady. "I think you're imagining things, James. Honestly, this is a little insulting." "Insulting?" He echoed the word, as if testing it out. He almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "Diane, for 10 years, I've believed every word that came out of your mouth. Now I find out about all these business trips." His voice faltered for a second, emotions brimming at the surface. "And now, I'm insulting you?" Diane's expression shifted, her face softening into something that resembled pity. "James, you know I travel a lot. That's never been a secret. My job demands it. You think I'd risk everything we've built? Risk my family?" His jaw clenched, the implication tugging painfully at his heart. "Yes, Diane. That's exactly what I think." For a moment, they were at a standstill, a silent battle where trust was a faint memory. She looked away, her gaze shifting to a spot on the wall, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of her napkin. It was the first crack in her calm demeanor, and it sent a small surge of satisfaction through him. She took a long breath, then sighed, her eyes downcast. "All right, James," she said finally, her tone quieter, almost defeated. "I didn't mean to hide things from you, but I may have been seeing someone on a few of these trips." Her words came out carefully, like each one had been weighed. Her admission, as quiet and veiled as it was a thunderclap in the room. The words hung between them, making him feel raw, exposed. This wasn't just a confession. It was the beginning of a painful unraveling. "You may have been seeing someone," he repeated, the bitterness cutting through his voice. "No, Diane, I think it's a bit more than may." She sighed, eyes narrowing, as though trying to decide how much more he could handle. "Look, I didn't want it to happen. It's not like that. But, it just did. These things, they're complicated." He scoffed, unable to contain his disbelief. "Complicated? Diane, you chose this. You didn't just fall into someone else's arms." Her expression turned defensive, her tone laced with frustration. "And maybe if you'd been around more." The accusation hit like a punch to his gut. He could feel anger flaring up, hot and consuming, but he forced himself to keep his composure, taking a slow breath to steady himself. "Don't you dare try to put this on me," he said, his voice shaking. The words seemed to have their intended effect. She paused, looking away, as if realizing she had crossed a line. He watched as she ran a hand through her hair, struggling to find the words, a hint of regret flickering in her expression. "I'm sorry," she whispered. It was barely audible, but in that moment, he saw the crack in her armor, the guilt that had gnawed at her. James couldn't stop the bitter laugh that escaped him. "Sorry." He stared at her, wondering how one word could carry so little weight. "Sorry doesn't even begin to cover it." The confession had changed something between them irreversibly. She looked away, her lips pressed into a thin line, silent as if awaiting judgment. He felt as though he were seeing her for the first time, this stranger who wore his wife's face. The love they had shared, the life they had built, all of it felt tainted, sullied beyond recognition. In the days that followed, Diane avoided him, keeping herself cloistered in her office, or scheduling meetings and activities that required her to be out of the house. James found himself drowning in a cocktail of grief, anger, and disbelief. At night, he lay awake, reliving the years they had spent together, sifting through memories with the cold lens of betrayal. Every anniversary dinner, every shared look across a room, every kiss before bed felt like a lie. One night, he found himself scrolling through old photos on his phone, his thumb lingering on an image of them at a beach years ago, grinning into the camera, carefree and completely in love. They looked like strangers to him now, like characters from another life. How could something so seemingly perfect have shattered into this? Desperate for some kind of closure, he dug deeper into her emails, her messages, even her credit card bills. He found receipts from upscale restaurants, from boutique hotels in cities he hadn't even known she'd visited. Each discovery was a new blow, each revelation further proof of the life she had led behind his back. He knew he couldn't keep spiraling like this, so he reached out to a therapist, a friend's recommendation. On his first visit, he sat in the therapist's office, arms crossed defensively as he recounted his story in halting phrases, trying to make sense of the chaos in his mind. The therapist, a calm woman with kind eyes, listened patiently, nodding. "Infidelity is often as much about the cheater's personal struggles as it is about the relationship," she said gently. "People have affairs for different reasons, and it doesn't always mean a lack of love. Sometimes, it's about unresolved issues within themselves." He bristled at her suggestion, unwilling to believe there could be any justification for Diane's betrayal. But the therapist's words lingered, burrowing into his thoughts, making him question everything he thought he knew. One evening, as he sat alone in the living room, a bottle of whiskey half empty by his side, Diane returned home. She walked into the room, her expression hesitant, watching him as if she were unsure whether to approach. He felt his stomach twist, but he kept his gaze fixed on the glass in his hand, unwilling to look at her. "James," she said softly, taking a step toward him. "We need to talk. I know I've hurt you, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to make things right, if that's even possible." He set his glass down, studying her face. The regret in her eyes was genuine, and he found himself wanting to believe her, to reach for the woman he'd loved for so long. But trust was a delicate thing, and once broken, it was nearly impossible to repair. "Why?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why wasn't I enough?" She hesitated, wringing her hands together, the question catching her off guard. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. Finally, she looked away, her shoulders slumping. "I don't know," she murmured. "Maybe I was scared of the life we had built, of losing myself in it. Maybe I was looking for something I thought I'd lost." He shook his head, feeling a mixture of pity and resentment. "And you thought you'd find it with him?" Diane's gaze dropped to the floor, guilt etched in every line of her face. "It wasn't about him, James. It was never really about him." They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of her words settling around them. James knew there was truth in what she'd said, but it didn't make the betrayal any easier to bear. It didn't change the fact that she had chosen someone else over him, that she had broken their bond in ways that could never be fully mended. As the night wore on, they talked about their past, their mistakes, and the broken pieces of their marriage. They spoke in low voices, their words raw, vulnerable, peeling back layers of resentment and regret they had both kept buried. It was painful, but beneath the hurt, James felt a glimmer of the connection they had once shared, a flicker of the love that had once bound them. By the time dawn began to break, they were both exhausted, emotionally drained. Diane looked at him, her expression softened, her voice barely a whisper. "I know it doesn't mean much now, but I never stopped loving you. Not even for a moment." He met her gaze, the words stirring a complicated mix of emotions within him. He wanted to believe her, to reach out and hold her, to let go of the anger and find solace in the love they had once shared. But trust was not something that could be rebuilt overnight, and the road ahead was fraught with uncertainty. For now, all he could do was nod, his heart heavy as he rose from his chair, leaving her alone in the dim light of the early morning, haunted by the fragments of a life they had both shattered. Days passed in a blur, each one bleeding into the next, an unending cycle of fractured conversations, hesitant glances, and suffocating silences. James felt like a ghost in his own home, each room a reminder of a life that now seemed distant, irretrievable. Diane moved about the house as if treading on eggshells, her face painted with guilt, her voice softened to the tone of someone pleading for absolution. He tried to resume some semblance of normalcy, forcing himself into routines that had once provided comfort. Yet everything felt tainted now. His morning coffee tasted bitter, their kitchen table, a place where they'd shared countless breakfasts, laughs, and quiet moments, felt as foreign as a stranger's house. It seemed impossible to breathe in the same space where memories once lived, now haunted by ghosts of betrayal. Diane had proposed therapy for them, a couples counselor she claimed could help them navigate the mess they had created. "If we want to fix this, we need someone to help us," she had said, her voice a fragile plea that echoed in his mind. He couldn't bear to look at her when she spoke of fixing things, as though their marriage was merely a shattered vase that could be glued back together. But he had agreed, because in the fog of his anger, there was a small flicker of hope, an ember of love that hadn't yet been extinguished. The therapist's office was located in a cozy house turned practice, decorated with soft lighting, beige couches, and framed quotes on the walls about strength and resilience. James sat beside Diane, close enough to feel her presence, yet miles apart in his mind. They had been coming for a few weeks now, sitting in those chairs, pouring out pieces of their lives in words that felt woefully inadequate. "Trust can be rebuilt," the therapist said one evening, her voice gentle, practiced. "But it's a slow process, and it requires vulnerability from both of you. James, I know you're in pain, and Diane, I know you're carrying regret. But the only way forward is to be open, even when it hurts." Diane nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes downcast. "I'm trying," she whispered. "I know I messed up. I don't expect him to forgive me right away, or maybe even ever. But I want him to know that I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. James listened, her words hollow, their sincerity suffocated by the image of her betrayal that played on loop in his mind. He wanted to believe her, to lean into the process, to allow the possibility of healing. But every time he looked at her, he saw her with him, Jeremy, the man who had unwittingly become the third presence in their marriage. On one of the days when Diane wasn't home, he found himself wandering into her office, a small, organized space filled with folders and books. It was the room she had spent countless hours in, the room where she had likely planned some of those business trips. The sterile scent of paper and her faint perfume lingered in the air, assaulting him with a mixture of nostalgia and bitterness. There, on her desk, sat a small framed photo of them together, a picture he hadn't seen in a while. It was from one of their anniversaries, the two of them beaming, arms wrapped around each other. He picked it up, staring at the past version of themselves, unburdened, ignorant of the pain that lay ahead. He barely recognized the joy on their faces, the trust in their eyes. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke his trance. He quickly set the photo down and retreated to the living room, sitting on the couch and composing himself as Diane entered the house, calling his name in her usual way. It was strange, hearing her voice filled with the same warmth, the same familiarity as always. How could she pretend that nothing had changed? She walked in, spotting him on the couch, a hesitant smile on her face. "I'm home," she said, as if announcing her arrival would somehow bridge the growing chasm between them. He nodded, not quite meeting her gaze. "Welcome back." Diane sat beside him, folding her hands in her lap, her expression one of cautious hope. "I know things are still hard," she said quietly. "But I want to thank you for trying. I know how hard it must be." He turned to look at her, trying to discern the sincerity in her eyes. There were moments when he believed her remorse, when he saw the love they had once shared glimmering beneath the surface. But then he'd remember the emails, the late nights, the stories she had spun, and the anger would surge anew. "I'm trying because I want to believe we can make it work," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But I need to know, why? Why him? Why did you do this to us?" Diane looked away, swallowing hard. "I wish I had an answer that would make sense," she began. "I felt lost, I guess. Like I was losing myself in all of it. Jeremy was," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "He was a distraction. A way for me to feel different. But it was a mistake, James. A terrible mistake." A bitter laugh escaped him. "A distraction? You destroyed us for a distraction?" She flinched, pain flickering across her face. "I know it sounds heartless. But it was never about him. It was about me, my own selfishness, my insecurities. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. I got lost." He stared at her, struggling to process her confession, his heart aching with the weight of her words. She had let her insecurities dismantle everything they had built together. He couldn't comprehend it, couldn't understand how she could have thrown everything away so carelessly. "But it meant something to me," he replied, his voice a whisper. "Our marriage meant something to me." Diane's eyes filled with tears, her voice trembling. "It meant everything to me, too. I know that sounds impossible to believe, but it's true. I was just so afraid of losing myself in all of it." James sat in silence, the weight of her confession pressing down on him, suffocating him. How could he rebuild something that had been so thoroughly shattered? How could he forgive a betrayal born out of such a careless need for self-discovery? In the following days, Diane's efforts to make amends grew more earnest. She filled the house with small gestures, favorite meals, shared moments on the couch, offers to watch movies they used to enjoy together. She even tried reigniting their intimacy, reaching for his hand, leaning in for kisses, her touch hesitant, testing the waters. And though James often recoiled, there were moments, fleeting but real, when he allowed himself to feel close to her again, to remember the warmth they once shared. But every time he allowed himself to soften, to lean into the comfort of their routine, he would catch a glimpse of her phone or remember one of her trips, and the anger would flare anew, the wounds in his heart tearing open again. Forgiveness, he realized, was not a choice but a slow and painful journey, one that required him to confront his own bitterness and fear. One evening, as they sat on the back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he turned to her, his voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "I want to forgive you, Diane. I want to rebuild what we had. But I don't know if I can. Every time I try, all I see is him." Diane looked at him, her face etched with sorrow. "I know. I see it in your eyes every time you look at me. And I know it's my fault. But I hope, someday, you can see me for who I am again, not who I became." James didn't reply, his gaze fixed on the distant hills, the flickering lights of their neighbors' houses dotting the landscape. He wished he could see her the way he once had, to erase the painful memories and replace them with the love they'd built. But love, he realized, was not a shield against betrayal. It could heal, yes, but only if he allowed himself to trust again. As they sat in silence, a thought crept into his mind: perhaps forgiveness was not a single act, a decision made in the heat of anger or the cool of contemplation. Perhaps it was a series of choices, each one made in the quiet moments when anger gave way to the faintest glimmers of hope. And perhaps, if he chose it often enough, he might one day look at her without seeing Jeremy, without feeling the sting of betrayal. But as he sat beside her, the scars of their past woven into the fabric of their marriage, he realized that this journey, like all journeys of healing, would take time. And in that quiet, shared moment, he resolved to give it just that, time. Months passed in the uneasy truce James and Diane had built, a fragile piece woven from tenuous forgiveness and unspoken pain. Each day felt like a test, a push and pull of emotions that kept them tethered to the fragments of their love, yet neither of them felt whole. The therapy sessions continued, but there was an undercurrent of exhaustion in every word exchanged, every wound re-examined. They grew tired of talking, of digging up the same hurt, reliving the same betrayal. It was on a quiet evening in late autumn when Diane came to him, her eyes hollow with a sadness he hadn't seen before. She stood in the doorway of their bedroom, her silhouette shadowed by the dim hallway light. James sat on the edge of the bed, looking up at her, sensing the weight of the words she was about to speak. "James," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "I can't keep doing this to you. I thought we could fix it, that maybe you'd be able to forgive me, but I was wrong. It's not fair to you. You deserve to be free from all of this." He stared at her, feeling a familiar pang in his chest, the ache of wanting things to go back to how they were. "You don't get to decide that," he said, his voice strained, though he wasn't sure if it was anger or sadness twisting his tone. "You don't get to decide what I can or can't handle." Her eyes glistened with tears, and she shook her head slowly. "You don't understand, James. I know I'm asking too much of you. I wanted to believe we could make it through, but I see the way you look at me. Every time you look at me, I know you're still hurting, that you're fighting yourself just to stay with me." She stepped into the room, sitting down on the bed beside him, though her gaze was fixed on the floor. "I thought I could live with the guilt, but it's crushing me, and it's not fair to you." She paused, exhaling slowly. "I don't think I can ever forgive myself, and I don't think you should have to keep forgiving me." James looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Her words cut deep, a sharp reminder of the truth he had been avoiding. He loved her, even now, but their love had become a painful thing, a burden he carried alone, a broken relic he was desperate to repair. Yet deep down, he knew that she was right. Each day was a struggle, each night an exercise in holding back the hurt that surged inside him. They sat in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them, binding them in shared sorrow. Finally, Diane rose, walking to the window and staring out at the leaf-strewn yard, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "I can't stay, James. I thought I could, but I can't. I need to go. Her words hung in the air, and he felt them settle around him, cold and heavy. He had anticipated this moment, braced himself for the possibility, yet it hit him with a force that left him hollowed out, a sense of finality that he wasn't ready to accept. "Where will you go?" he asked, his voice barely audible, struggling to keep the pain from spilling over. "I don't know," she replied, her voice trembling. "But I think it's best if we start over separately. I don't want to keep hurting you, James. And I don't want to keep hurting myself." A long silence filled the room as he tried to gather his thoughts, to find something, anything, that might change her mind. But he knew there were no words left, no more promises that could bridge the gap between them. He nodded slowly, feeling as though he were being pulled under, dragged into a dark current that would consume him. "If that's what you want," he said finally, barely recognizing his own voice, "then maybe it's best." She turned back to him, and he saw the mixture of relief and sorrow in her eyes. There was no joy in her decision, no triumph. It was simply an end, an inevitable conclusion to the long and painful journey they had been on. She reached out, resting a hand on his shoulder, and for a moment, he felt the warmth of her touch, a reminder of what they had once shared. In the days that followed, Diane began packing her things, quietly and methodically, moving through the house with a sense of resignation. James watched her with a numb acceptance, unable to shake the feeling that he was watching their life unravel before his eyes. He found himself wandering through empty rooms, rooms that once held laughter and love, now hollowed out by silence and memories. On the last evening before she was set to leave, they sat together on the couch, a bottle of wine between them, though neither of them had taken more than a sip. The air was thick with unspoken words, memories of their shared life pressing down on them, lingering in the dim light. Diane leaned back, closing her eyes, and he watched her, committing every detail to memory, the way her hair fell across her shoulder, the soft rise and fall of her breath, the faint scent of her perfume that had become so familiar. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as though the words were meant only for herself. He didn't reply, unable to summon a response. He had heard her apologies countless times, each one a reminder of the pain they had both endured, of the love that had slowly decayed into this hollow, fragile thing. He closed his eyes, letting the silence envelop them, a final shared moment before the inevitable goodbye. The next morning, he stood at the door as she picked up her last bag, pausing to look back at him one final time. Her eyes met his, filled with a sadness that mirrored his own, a deep and aching sorrow that words could not express. I hope you can find peace, James," she said softly, her voice laced with regret. "I hope you can forgive me someday." He nodded, feeling the words slip through his fingers, useless and empty. "Goodbye, Diane." She hesitated, then turned and walked out the door, leaving him alone in the silence of their empty home. In the weeks that followed, James fell into a routine, a hollow repetition of days that blurred into each other. He returned to work, threw himself into projects, filling his days with tasks that kept his mind occupied, but nothing could fill the void she had left behind. The house was quiet now, stripped of her presence, each room a painful reminder of what had once been. One evening, as he was sorting through some papers in her old office, he stumbled upon a letter tucked between two books on her shelf. It was addressed to him, her handwriting delicate and familiar. With trembling hands, he unfolded it, his heart pounding as he began to read. Dear James. If you're reading this, it means I've left, and I'm not sure if I'll ever have the chance to tell you what I need to say. I know I hurt you in ways I can never undo, and for that, I will always be sorry. You gave me love and kindness when I needed it most, and I betrayed that love. I lost myself in ways I can't explain, and I hurt the one person who truly loved me. I want you to know that, even in my darkest moments, I never stopped loving you. Maybe I was selfish, maybe I was weak, but that love never left. I know it doesn't change what happened, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I needed you to know that it was real, that you were my anchor, even when I drifted away. I don't know what the future holds, but I hope you find peace. I hope you find happiness again, the kind that we once shared. You deserve that, James. You always did. Goodbye, my love. Diane. He sat back, the letter falling from his hands, her words echoing in the empty room. For a long time, he sat in the silence, letting the sorrow wash over him, the final remnants of their love lingering in her words. He knew now that there would be no going back, no chance to repair what had been broken. She was gone, and with her, she had taken the life they had built together, leaving only memories and regrets in her wake. And as the sun set outside the window, casting shadows across the room, he realized that some things were meant to be left behind, even when they left a scar that would never truly fade. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, was now a monument to the love they had lost, a love that had slipped through his fingers, leaving him with nothing but an empty echo, a silent reminder of what had once been and could never be again.